Everybody out here has a story about the animal they should have let die. Mine was born on a Sunday in the worst June this valley ever had, in the bottom of a dry wash while hail came down the size of pullet eggs, and the mare who was carrying him bled out into gravel that hadn't seen water in 11 months. He came out crooked and cold and covered in spots, the wrong spots, the kind that make a buyer laugh through his nose and say, "What happened to that one?" And he weighed less than a bale of alfalfa, and he couldn't stand. I had a rifle in the truck. I had a banknote past due and 41 head of cattle I couldn't water, and a wife 2 years in the ground who used to keep the names of horses on the back page of the checkbook like she was expecting a whole lifetime of them. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest. I did not save that colt because I'm a good man. I have never once in 61 years been accused of that. I saved him because I was too tired to walk back to the truck. That's the truth. Everything after that, the mare I had to beg for, the thing I said to my son that I can't take back, the morning in November when the whole thing turned over like a stone and showed me what had been living underneath it the entire time. All of that came out of one lazy, stubborn, half-drowned decision made by a man who just didn't feel like climbing a hill. You want to know what changed everything? It wasn't the horse. Stay with me. The hail started while I still had my arm inside her. I want to say I noticed. I want to say I looked up at that green-black bruise of a sky rolling down off the Sacramentos and thought something about God, or my wife, or the price of yearlings. But the truth is I didn't notice the hail until a chunk of it hit the back of my neck and slid down under my collar. And by then I was elbow-deep and swearing in a voice that didn't sound like mine. The mare's name was Belle. She was a plain bay, 9 years old, nothing special, and she had gone down in the bottom of Cañada Seca, where the gravel is white and sharp as broken plates. She'd walked a mile from the corral to do it. Horses do that. They find the one place you'd never look and they lie down in it like they're apologizing for the trouble. I'd found her because the dog wouldn't shut up. "Belle," I said, "Belle girl, come on now." She didn't answer. Her eye was rolled back so far I could see the white all around it, that flat blue-white you see on a china plate, and her sides went up and down too fast and too shallow, and every time she pushed, more of her came out with the foal than ought to. I had one arm in her to the shoulder and my knees were in the gravel, and the gravel was going through my jeans, and the hail was coming down and bouncing off the rocks like somebody was throwing handfuls of gravel back at the earth. A leg, I had a leg. I had one leg and I could not find the other one. I know what that means. Everybody who's ever pulled a calf or a foal at 2 in the morning with a flashlight in their teeth knows what one leg means. It means the other one's tucked back at the shoulder, and it means that shoulder is a wedge, and it means you have about 4 minutes to fix something that ought to take a veterinarian and a clean table and a light that doesn't flicker. I did not have a veterinarian. I had Doc Ainsley in Alamogordo, 62 miles, and a truck with a bad alternator, and a checkbook the bank had opinions about. So I did what my father did and his father did. I pushed him back in. You have to push them back in, is the thing nobody tells you. Against everything in your body screaming out, out, get him out. You have to shove a live foal backwards into a dying mare and go past him and find the folded leg by feel, and the whole time she's clamping down on your arm hard enough that you can feel your own pulse in the bones of your hand. I found a knee, I hooked it. Belle screamed. It's not a sound like a horse makes. I want you to understand that. It's a sound like a nail coming out of green lumber, and it went up that wash and off the rimrock and came back at me. And I heard myself saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, girl, I'm sorry. In the same voice I used at the hospital in Roswell when they turned off the machine and Margie's chest went flat and stayed that way. That's a hell of a thing, isn't it? Same voice, 20 months apart. Man's only got so many voices. The leg came around. And then the whole of him came out into my lap in a rush of hot water and blood, in a gray hail-lit wash on the last Sunday in June. And Belle stopped screaming and lay still with her nostrils opening and closing like a fish on a bank. I want to say I looked at him and knew. I didn't know anything. I was 59 kinds of tired, and my right arm had gone numb to the elbow, and I had a dead-eyed mare's blood soaking through my jeans, and there was a wet, steaming, dark thing in the gravel between my knees that wasn't moving. I cleared his nose with 2 fingers, peeled the sack back off him. Nothing. I hit him, hard, flat of my hand, right across the ribs, the way you'd slap a stalled engine. I have done this maybe 11 times in my life, and it has worked maybe 4. Nothing. I hit him again and I said, and I am not proud of this, I said, "Don't you dare." Which is a stupid thing to say to a foal. He didn't know he was daring anything. He didn't know anything at all yet. He had been alive for 11 seconds, and most of those he'd spent drowning. But he coughed. He coughed, and a great ribbon of fluid came out of him, and he took the first breath, and it went into him so hard his whole body arched, like a fish, like something hooked, and his eyes came open. And in the middle of all that, the mare dying, and the hail turning the wash white, and my arm shaking so bad I couldn't have held a cup of coffee, I looked down at what I'd just pulled out of the world. He was covered in spots. Not paint markings. Not the big honest brown and white you see on every kid's pony from here to Tucson. He was a dark, muddy roan color across the front, and from the shoulders back he ran into a blanket of white flecked all over with little dark spots, dozens of them, hundreds, and they were splashed up onto his hindquarters, and down his stifle like somebody had shaken a paintbrush at him in the dark. His hooves were striped. The skin around his eye was mottled pink and black like a bad map. And Belle was a plain bay, and the stud I'd paid $400 for was a plain, honest, blood bay quarter horse out of a working line, with papers, with a pedigree. And I had a contract with a man in Silver City who was buying 6 foals sight unseen at $1,100 a head because he liked the mare line. Sight unseen. I sat back on my heels in the hail, and I started to laugh. It wasn't a good laugh. There was something wrong at the bottom of it. It went on longer than laughing ought to, and it turned somewhere in the middle into something else, and I was glad down to my boots, that there was nobody in that wash to hear it but a mare who was busy dying. Here's what a Sunday cost me, in the summer I'm telling you about. 11 months without rain. Not drought the way the newspaper says it, with a map and a color code. Drought the way it actually is, the tank at the south windmill going down an inch a day, and the mud around it printed all over with the tracks of everything in the county that was thirsty, coyote and cow and deer, and once, in April, a bear tracked the size of a dinner plate that made me stand there for a while thinking about how far something has to walk before it stops caring who sees it drink. 41 head, where I used to run 300. A note at First National for $64,000, secured by 4 sections of land my grandfather stole fair and square from a man who stole it fair and square from somebody else. And a green cloth-bound ledger. I should tell you about the ledger because everybody who knows me makes a joke about it eventually, and you may as well get yours in early. It's a cattleman's record book, the kind they used to sell at the co-op in Chilarosa before the co-op became a place that sells scented candles. I have kept one every year since I was 19. Rain in the left column, head count, feed, vet, the date the first heifer calves and the date the last one does. And in the margins, because Margie started it, and because after she died I found I couldn't stop, other things. April 4, wind, we's called didn't say much. May 19, nothing. May 20, nothing. I have a whole page of nothing, one after another down the margin, in my own handwriting, and I don't remember writing a single one of them. That night, the last Sunday of June, I wrote. June 29, hail 20 min, no rain to speak of. Belle foaled in Cañada Seca dead by 6 p.m., colt alive, spotted, some kind of joke. And then underneath in smaller letters. Because a man alone at a kitchen table at midnight will write anything. Couldn't leave him. too far to carry the rifle back. That is a lie, and I knew it when I wrote it. The rifle was in the truck. The truck was 300 yards up the wash. I've walked further than that to check a fence I already knew was fine. The first thing to understand about a foal is that he cannot wait. He's got a window, 12 hours, maybe 18. Then the gut closes up like a fist, and whatever antibodies he didn't get, he never gets. He has no immune system. He is a warm, wet bag of nothing with legs, and everything in the world, every bacterium in the barn dirt and every fly that lands on him, is looking at him the way I look at a steak. Belle was dead. I milked her anyway. I want you to sit with that for a second. It was full dark, and I had a coffee can and a headlamp with a battery going brown, and I knelt in the gravel of that wash and stripped what I could out of a horse who'd been dead an hour and had already gone stiff enough in the neck that her head wouldn't move when I pushed it. I got maybe a cup and a half. It came out thick and yellow like honey gone wrong, colostrum. I got it into him with a 50cc syringe with the needle off, squirting it back along his tongue while he fought me, and half of it ran down my wrist and into my sleeve, and I sat in the dark of Cañada Seca smelling like a dead horse's milk, with the hail melting under me and a colt's ribs going in and out against my leg. His head was too big for him. That's the thing I remember. His head was too big, and his knees were too big, and everything in between him was too small, and when I ran my hand down his neck, I could count every single one of his ribs with 2 fingers and a thumb. He never nickered, not once. Foals nicker, they make this small, ridiculous sound like a rusty hinge, and he didn't do it. He just watched me. He had one wall eye, pale, blue-white, the eye of a fish or a saint, and he watched me with it and didn't blink. I carried him up out of that wash at 9 at night. 61 years old with a bad hip and 40-some pounds of colt across my shoulders like a man carrying a rolled-up rug he's ashamed of, up a slope of white gravel in the dark, stopping 4 times. 4 times I stopped and set him down and thought about it. I'm not going to dress that up. I stopped 4 times, and every one of those times I looked at that half-drowned spotted thing lying in the rocks with his too big head on the ground, and I did the arithmetic. Milk replacer, $40 a bag, and he'd go through a bag every 10 days. Round-the-clock feeding every 2 hours for a month. No mare. No barn help. 41 head of cattle to keep alive on a dying windmill. $64,000. And at the end of all that, if it worked, if he didn't founder, if he didn't scour himself to death, if he didn't twist a gut on the milk replacer like the last one I tried this with in 1987, at the end of it, I'd have a spot-marked orphan that no man in this state would buy for a saddle horse, because that's not how it works out here, and you can call it stupid if you want to. You can call it superstition. There's a whole century of men in this valley who'll tell you a colored horse is a horse somebody didn't want, and the fact that they're wrong doesn't make them any less certain. 4 times. The 4th time I sat down beside him, and I put my hand flat on his ribs to feel him breathe, and I said, out loud to nobody, "This is the dumbest thing you have ever done." And I picked him up and carried him the rest of the way. Now, you've heard 100 stories that start like that, and I know how they go, and I want to head you off. In those stories, the man carries the animal home, and there's a warm barn and a soft light, and some music comes up, and the next thing you know it's spring and everybody's better. Here's what actually happened. He scoured on the 3rd day. That means what you think it means. Green, and then yellow, and then a kind of clear water that comes out of him faster than anything I could put in, and he lay in the straw with his tail pasted to his legs and his eyes half shut, and every hour of that I sat in the corner of that stall on an upturned bucket with a ledger on my knee, writing down times. 2:15 a.m., 6 Oz held it. 4:00 a.m., 6 Oz brought most back up. 6:00 a.m. refused. He got a fever. I put him in the stock tank up to his chest at 3 in the morning with the hose running, and stood in it with him in my boots, holding his head up out of the water, and the water was so cold my feet went stupid, and I remember thinking with total clarity, if you drop him, he drowns and it's over and you can go to bed. I did not drop him. By the 5th day he'd lost so much weight his hip bones stood out of him like tent poles, and the skin over his ribs had gone loose the way an old man's does. He would not stand. He would lie flat on his side with his neck stretched out, and every couple hours I'd roll him over onto the other side so the down lung wouldn't fill, and each time I rolled him he'd make a small grunt, and that was the only sound he made in 5 days. He was going to die, anybody could see it, I could see it. And on the 5th night, I went out to the barn at midnight with the rifle. I want to be honest here, more honest than I have been about anything in this story, because if I lie about this part then the rest of it doesn't mean anything. I loaded it in the kitchen. 2 rounds, because it's disrespectful to load one and be wrong. I walked out under a sky so full of stars it looked like somebody had thrown salt at it, and my boots went crunch, crunch, crunch on the gravel, and the dog got up from the porch and then thought better of it and lay back down, and even the dog knew. I opened the stall door. He was lying on his side in the straw exactly the way I'd left him, and his ribs were moving, and when the door opened, he lifted his head about 2 inches off the ground and looked at me with that pale wall eye. That's all, he lifted his head. And I stood there in the door of my own barn with a rifle in my hands for, I don't know. It felt like an hour. It was probably 90 seconds. You want to know what I was thinking about? Not mercy. Not the money. I was thinking about a thing my wife said to me in the kitchen in 1994 when Weeze was 15 and had put a fist through the drywall in the hallway over something neither of them could remember 2 days later. I'd said, that boy is going to be nothing but trouble. And Margie put down the dish she was drying, and she looked at me and she said, Cal, you always did give up on things the exact minute they got hard enough to be worth something. And she went back to drying the dish, because she was not a woman who needed to win anything. I put the rifle in the corner of the tack room, and I sat down in the straw, and I put that colt's enormous stupid head in my lap. He didn't move. It was too warm, his head fever warm. I could feel the little pulse in his jaw. I said, you'd better not make a liar out of her. He breathed, and after a while so did I. Junie Altaha came up the road on the 9th day. She'd been shoeing for me 2 years by then, since old Ruddy Vasquez's hands went. She was maybe 26, mescalero, built like a fence post and about as easy to move, and she drove a Ford with 3 different colors of fender and a forge in the bed. She'd come up to the house and she wouldn't knock. She'd just stand on the porch until you noticed her. She noticed the wheelbarrow of soiled straw before she noticed me. Who's sick? Nobody. She looked at me. She had a way of looking at you where she'd wait and keep waiting, and you'd fill up the silence yourself just to make it stop. I have known preachers who couldn't do that. Bell's colt, I said. Bell died. That's why he's a problem. She went in the barn. I followed her. I remember I was embarrassed. The stall was a disaster. Syringes in a coffee can, the bucket I'd been sitting on, a bag of milk replacer with the top rolled down and a scoop stuck in it, and my green ledger sitting on a hay bale with a pen through the spiral. Junie crouched at the colt's head. She was quiet a long time, long enough that I said, Doc says he's a coin flip. That was a lie. Doc Ainsley had never seen him. 62 miles and a truck with a bad alternator and $80 just for him to walk in the door. Junie put her hand on the colt's neck and ran it back over the blanket of spots, the little dark flecks in the white, and her thumb stopped on the mottled skin around his eye. She said, where's the sire from? Silver City, Bay, registered. Not the sire. She was still looking at the colt. Belle, where'd you get her? Bought her at Lordsburg. She was a 5-year-old. I heard my own voice getting defensive and I didn't know why. She's plain bay, Junie was. Sure. She scratched under the colt's jaw with 2 fingers. Doesn't matter what she was. matters what she was carrying. Then she said something in Apache. It wasn't loud, it wasn't for me. I said, don't do that. She looked up. He's dying, I said. Don't say anything over him. I don't want anything said over him. And Junie Altaha stood up and dusted the straw off her knees and looked at me with something I couldn't read at all. And she said, Cal, he's not the one I said it for. She's the one who told me about Boyce's mare. She'd shod for him on Tuesday. He had a 5-year-old mare who'd lost a foal to red bag, came out dead, never took a breath, and she was standing in a corral bagged up full of milk with nothing to give it to, calling for a foal that was buried under the mesquite behind his shop. A nurse mare. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. Because here is what I had not told you. Harlan Boyce owned the land east of me, and 11 years earlier, when the Ferguson estate sold, he had bought the water, not the land. The water. He bought the rights to the Seca draw wells out from under me by 9 days and $8,000, and he did it after sitting at my kitchen table and eating my wife's pie and telling me he wasn't interested. Margie forgave him. She was like that. She said, Cal, he's a small man with a small idea of what he needs. I did not forgive him. For 11 years I had driven past his gate and looked straight ahead like it wasn't there. For 11 years the sight of his truck at the feed store had sent me back out to sit in mine until he left. Once, at Sonny Delgado's funeral, we ended up shoulder to shoulder in the receiving line and neither of us said a word, and I have thought about that silence more times than I have thought about my own father. And now God, or the drought, or whatever it is that arranges these things for its own amusement, had put the one thing that could save that colt into a corral on Harlan Boyce's place. Junie watched my face. He'd lease you the mare, she said. He's not doing anything with her. No. Cal. I said no. She picked up her hammer off the tailgate, and she was quiet a minute, and then she said, without any heat in it at all, you know what my grandfather would say. I don't want to know. He'd say a man who'd rather be right than have a horse is going to end up right. She got in the truck, alone in a barn, being right. I lasted 4 days. 4 days of 2-hour feeds. 4 days of watching a colt get smaller inside his own hide. On the 4th night, at about 2 in the morning, I mixed a bottle and knelt down, and he turned his head away from it. Didn't fight. Just turned his head away, deliberate, and put his nose in the straw. I sat there with the bottle in my hand. Out in the dark the windmill was creaking, that sound like a door in an empty house, and I thought about how I would find him in the morning. I could already see it, legs out straight, straw stuck to his eye. And I thought about the $64,000 and the 41 head, and the sight of Harlan Boyce eating pie at my table with his hat on the empty chair. And I heard my wife say, the exact minute they got hard enough to be worth something. I drove to Boyce's at 4 in the morning. I want that understood. 4 in the morning, no headlights on his drive because I couldn't stand the idea of him seeing them coming, and I sat in the truck outside that dark house for 20 minutes with my hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 like a boy taking a driving test. Then I got out and knocked on the door of a man I had hated for 11 years. And when the porch light came on and he stood there in a t-shirt and boxer shorts with his hair all one way, I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Nothing. I stood on Harlan Boyce's porch at 4 in the morning with my hat in my hand, and I could not make a sound. He looked at me. He was 68 and he had a scar through one eyebrow from a horse, and his mouth was doing something complicated. Cal, he said. Belle's dead. My voice came out wrong. There's a colt. Boyce looked past me at my truck, still running, driver's door hanging open, the way you leave it when you're not sure you're staying. He said, give me a minute to find my pants. Grafting a foal onto a mare who isn't his is one of the ugliest, most beautiful things I have ever been a party to. And I have been present at 3 human births and 1 human death. You have to fool her. We hauled the mare over in Boyce's stock trailer at first light. Her name was Ruby. She came down that ramp screaming for a foal that had been dead 9 days, and when she got in the pen she went around it, and around it, and around it, her bag so tight it shone, milk running down the inside of her hind legs. The colt could not stand. That's problem one. A mare wants to smell a foal's tail and a foal's neck, and she wants him to nurse, and mine was flat on his side and hadn't been on his feet in 2 days. Boyce didn't say anything about that. He went and got the dead foal. I'm not going to be graphic. He'd buried it shallow under the mesquite, and it was 9 days in July, and he brought it in a feed sack, and he took his knife and he took the hide off it there in my corral, kneeling in the dawn with his back to me and the flies already finding him. Then he draped that hide over my colt like a coat. And I held that colt's head up off the ground with both hands under his jaw, and Boyce backed off, and Ruby came. She came fast, and she came hard, and she got her nose down into that hide, and she made a sound, a deep, chuffing, rolling nicker that came up out of the bottom of her chest. A sound I have heard maybe 40 times in my life, and never once without something happening in my throat, and she started licking. She licked all down that dead hide, and she licked past the edge of it onto the colt's wet neck, and she didn't stop. She licked him for 11 minutes. I counted, because I had nothing else to do but hold his head and count. And on minute 12, that colt, who had not stood in 2 days, who had refused a bottle, who had turned his head into the straw to die, got one front foot under himself. I said, "Don't." Boyce said, "Let him." He got the second foot up. His hind end was still down. He hung there on those 2 front legs, shaking so hard the hide slid half off him, that ridiculous head swaying, and Ruby went around behind him and put her nose under his tail and shoved. He came up. He came up like a card table, like a badly built thing, all 4 legs at wrong angles, and he stood there in the middle of the pen wearing another foal's skin. And he swung that big head around, and he found her flank, and he found the bag, and he latched on. I heard him swallow. That is a sound, a foal nursing. It's a wet, greedy, ugly, thumping sound, and I have heard it 1,000 times, and I want you to know that I sat down in the dirt of my own corral, and I put my hands over my face like a child. I don't know how long, a while. When I got up, Boyce was leaning on the pipe fence with his back to me, looking at nothing, giving me the privacy, and I understood then that he was doing it on purpose and had been for some time. I said, "What do you want for her?" He didn't turn around. He said, "Cow." I said, "I asked what you want." And there was a long silence in which the colt nursed and the mare stood over him, and the sun came up over the Sacramentos and lit the whole corral orange. And Harlan Boyce said, to the fence post in front of him, "Margie made a real good pie." He wouldn't take money. He wouldn't take money, and I stood in that corral and I got angry at him for it. Angry the way you get at somebody who takes away the last thing that lets you keep hatting them. And I said some things I'm not going to repeat, and Boyce stood there and let me. And when I ran out of air, he put his hat on and said, "She's got about 4 more months of milk in her. Bring her back in November," and got in his truck. And that's where you think this ends. That would be a nice place, wouldn't it? The colt on his feet, the old enemies, the sun coming up. It was Wheeze who broke it. My son called in the middle of August. He hadn't called since Easter. He was in Phoenix doing something with commercial HVAC that he'd explained to me twice, and I'd failed to hold onto both times, and he had a girl there, and he was 39 years old, and I had not seen him in 14 months. He called about the ranch. He talked to somebody, a landman. There were 4 sections, and the state was buying up ground for something solar, or the base, or the county's water future. They never quite say. And there was a number, and the number was 2.1 million, and we said it the way you'd hand somebody a glass of water. He said, "Dad, you're 61. You're out there alone." He said, "You don't even have cattle anymore. You've got 40 head. He said Mom would have wanted. And I said, don't. There was a silence on that telephone, long-distance silence with that faint hum in it. And then I said the thing I've been circling this whole time. I said, you want to know what your mother would have wanted? She'd have wanted you at that hospital. She'd have wanted you in the room. He didn't hang up. That's the part I can't get past. He didn't hang up, he just stopped talking, and I stood in my own kitchen listening to my son not talk, and the clock on the stove said 8:41, and out the window I could see a spotted colt asleep flat on his side in the dry lot with a bay mare standing over him, one hind foot cocked, guarding a thing that wasn't hers. After about 15 seconds we said, very quietly, "Okay, Dad." And he hung up. I wrote it in the ledger that night. I want you to know exactly what I wrote, because I've read that page maybe 400 times since. Aug 14, 101 degrees, hauled water to South Tank 2 trips, we's called about selling, said something I shouldn't have. Colt gaining, standing to nurse W out help. I'm a coward and it's cheaper to be won over the phone. The colt lived. That's the first miracle, and it's a small one, and it happened so gradually that I couldn't tell you the day it stopped being in doubt. Sometime in September, he had a coat on him that shone. Sometime in September, he started running the fence line at dusk for no reason at all, except that he was young, and it was cool, and his legs worked, and the spots on him would blur when he ran until he looked like something coming apart. He had the wall eye. He had striped hooves and mottled skin around his mouth like an old man's hands. He had a set of markings that no buyer within 400 miles would look at twice. And he had one thing more, which I noticed in October and dismissed, and noticed again in November and did not. He would not let anybody behind him. Not out of fear. Fear, I know. Fear is a horse throwing his head and rolling an eye and moving his feet in a hurry. This wasn't that. This was that if you walked toward his hindquarters, he would turn, calm as a man, and face you, and put his shoulder between you and wherever it was he thought he was standing guard over. And what he was standing guard over, 9 times out of 10, was the mare. Ruby. He was 4 months old, and he was tucking a full-grown mare in behind his shoulder, and he did it without hurry, and he did it every single time. Junie saw it first. She'd come to trim him free, and she'd have fought me about the money if I'd offered, and she stood up out of a crouch with his hind foot still in her hands, and she looked at me over his back. "Cal, I see it." "Do you?" She set the foot down. She ran her palm up his hocks over the blanket of spots and stopped again on that mottled skin at his eye. "You know what my grandfather calls those?" "I don't." "The old horses, before the army came through in the 1870s and shot them all so we couldn't ride." She said it exactly like that, flat, the way you'd say before the rain. "They took 1,100 head from the Nez Perce and killed most of them in one afternoon. Same thing happened here, just smaller, so nobody wrote it down. Every so often one comes back up out of the ground." She stepped away from him and he turned, unhurried, to face her. "He isn't a mistake," she said. "He's a remainder." I laughed at her. I want you to know that. I stood in my own corral in October and I laughed at that girl and said something about how a horse is a horse and papers are papers, and it didn't much matter what he was, because in 6 months he'd be gelding age and worth about $400 to a man in Deming who wanted something colorful for his granddaughter. Junie put her tools in the truck. She said, "Whatever helps." And she drove down my road, and I stood there with my hand on the neck of a spotted colt, and I did not know, I had no way to know, standing in the dust with my hat in my hand, that in 22 days a man from Ruidoso would come up that same road in a white Julie with a trailer and a checkbook and a photograph on his phone, and would stand in the yard looking at that horse for a long, long time without saying anything at all. That he'd ask me one question. That the answer to it would take everything I thought I knew about the last 11 years of my life, and about Harlan Boyce, and about my wife, and turn it over like a flat stone. and show me what had been living underneath it the whole time. November 1st, that's when it starts. I still haven't told anybody what he said. That's how I knew somebody was coming before I saw anything. Because that dog is 14 years old and deaf on the left side, and hasn't cared about a vehicle since the Obama administration. And he came off the porch stiff-legged and stood in the middle of the yard with his hackles up like a man remembering an old grudge. November 1st. Frost on the water trough that morning, the first of the year. A skin of it you could pick up whole in 2 fingers and hold to the light before it broke. I'd been out at the south windmill since 6, greasing the head, and I'd come back with my hands black and my breath showing, and a cold in my knuckles I've had every winter since 1979. The truck was white, new, a Julie with Lincoln County plates and a 2-horse slant behind it, empty, which is a thing that will make a rancher's stomach drop before he can tell you why. He parked crooked, the way people do when they're not planning to stay, and he sat in there a minute writing something. Then he got out. He was 60 maybe, silver in his mustache, a canvas coat that had been expensive about 12 years ago and had been worn every day since, which I respected before I'd heard him say a word. He didn't come at me. He stopped at the front of his truck and let me finish crossing the yard, and when I got there he put out his hand and said, "Dale Cordova, Ruidoso." "Cal Renner." "I know." He looked past me. That's all he did. He looked past my shoulder, and out in the dry lot behind the barn, a 4-month-old colt was standing with his hip cocked in the sun, spotted from the withers back, and Ruby was lipping at a fence post beside him, and the colt turned his head and looked back at Dale Cordova across 150 feet of dirt. I have thought many times about what happened in the next little while, and I still don't have a good word for it. Cordova didn't say nice colt. He didn't say anything. He took 2 steps forward so that he was standing in my yard and not beside his truck, and he took his hat off. Not a big gesture. He just took it off and held it against his leg, the way a man does going into a church he isn't a member of. And he stood there. I want you to understand that it went on long enough to be rude. Long enough that I said, "You want coffee?" and he didn't hear me. Long enough that I looked at the side of his face and saw his jaw working, and saw that the man was somewhere else entirely, somewhere back down a road I hadn't been on. Then he said quietly, not to me, "Well, hell. I'll tell you what I thought. I thought buyer. I want that on the record, because it's the last honest ugly thing I did in this story, and I'd rather put it in myself than have you find it. I looked at that white Julie and that empty trailer and that expensive coat, and I ran the arithmetic that I had been running in my sleep since June, $64,000, 41 head, a windmill pumping 4 gallons a minute where it used to pump 9, and I thought, this man wants that horse and he doesn't know what he's worth, and by God I am going to find out. So I got cagey. I did the whole thing. I said the colt wasn't for sale in a voice that means make an offer. I mentioned the sire bay, registered out of a working line down at Silver City, papers in the house, and I watched Cordova's face to see the number go up. His face didn't move. I said, course, he's colored, which is a strike against him for most fellas. And Dale Cordova, who had not stopped looking at that colt in something like 4 minutes, said, "Mr. Renner, I've got one question for you, and then I'll get out of your yard." "All right." He turned around. He had a phone in his hand. He'd had it in his hand the whole time and I hadn't noticed, and there was a photograph on the screen, and he held it out to me the way you'd hand somebody a hot pan. "Who told you the sire was a bay?" The photograph was 3 years old. He said so later. Taken in bad light, early morning, over the top rail of a pipe corral with the sun coming from the wrong direction, so that everything in the frame is a little washed and a little too bright. There is a stallion in it. He is standing square in the middle of a pen, and he is dark in front, a deep, muddy. Roaned out red, and from the shoulders back he runs into a white blanket flecked all over with dark spots. Dozens of them, hundreds, splashed up over his hip and down his stifle like somebody shook a brush at him in the dark. There is mottled pink and black skin around his mouth. His near side hoof is striped, and his off eye, catching the low sun, is pale as a fish. I looked at that photograph for a long time. And then, because the eye goes where it goes, and because a man's eye is a coward and will look at anything rather than the thing in front of it, my eye slid off the horse and into the corner of the frame. At the edge, half out of the shot, out of focus, mid-turn, walking away from the camera with a lead rope over her shoulder, there is a woman in a green coat. You know the coat. You've got one in your closet, or your mother did. Quilted, dark green, a tear on the left sleeve mended with dental floss because that's what was in the drawer, and the mend went crooked and she said she'd fix it right and never did. And it hung on a nail by my kitchen door for 20 months after she died because I could not make my hand take it down. I know the exact angle of that shoulder. I know how she carried a rope. I said, "Where was this?" Cordova said, "Sir." I said, "Where was this taken?" And he said, "About 4 miles east of here, man named Boyce." I want to tell you that I drove over there. I did, eventually. But before that I went in my own house, past the coat nail, and I went to the shelf in the hall closet where I keep the ledgers, and I have 39 of them, one for every year since I was 19, and they are stacked in order, and the older ones have gone the color of weak tea. I took down last year's. And I stood in that hallway in my greasy coveralls, with the front door hanging open and Dale Cordova standing in my yard being polite to my dog, and I turned to July. Belle was bred the second week of July. That's in there. July 12. Belle to Rio live cover took first time. Rio being the bay, the $400 bay, honest as bread. 9 days before that. July 3, hot. Belle out through the east wire sometime in the night, found her at Boyce's tank with his stock. Fixed the wire, nothing to it. Nothing to it. I have written that phrase, or one just like it, 400 or 500 times in my life. It is a man's way of closing a door on something he does not want to walk through. And I stood in the hall with the book open on my 2 hands, and I read my own handwriting from 16 months ago, and I did the count on my fingers like a child. And July 3rd to June 29th is 361 days. Which is exactly to the day how long a mare carries a foal. Cordova wanted to come with me. I told him no. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and said, "Mr. Renner, I don't think you should drive right now," which is a thing men say when they mean I don't think you should arrive right now, and he was correct, and I got in the truck anyway. 11 years, I had driven past that gate looking straight ahead. I turned in and I didn't slow down. I came up that caliche road throwing rocks off both back tires, and I stopped in his yard sideways, and Harlan Boyce came out onto his porch drying his hands on a dish towel, and he saw my face and he stopped drying them. He said, "Cal." I said, "Where is he?" Boyce didn't ask who. That's the thing. That's the whole thing right there in the first 3 seconds. He did not ask who. He did not say, "What are you talking about?" He did not put one single second of daylight between my question and his answer. He looked at me across his own porch railing with the towel still in his hands, and something went out of him all at once, and he looked 20 years older than he had in June. He said, "Back pen, behind the shop." He was 18 years old. That's the first thing. I had come up that road with my heart going like a hammer, expecting God knows what, a young horse, a stallion in his prime, something worth stealing and lying about for 11 years. And what was standing in the back pen behind Harlan Boyce's shop was an old horse. He had a sway to his back. He had gray coming in over his eyes and in the hollows above them, the way it does. He was picking at a flake of alfalfa with the deliberateness of an animal who has all the time in the world and knows exactly how much of it is left. And when we came around the corner of the shop, he lifted his head and looked at us with a pale wall eye, and there was nothing in his face at all. Nothing, no fear, no interest. He had seen men before. I put my hands on the rail. I couldn't have told you my own name. That blanket, those hooves, the mottled skin around the mouth like a hand that's been in water too long. And when he moved, when he took 2 steps toward the fence out of nothing but old politeness, he turned, and he put his shoulder between us and the empty pen behind him, and he stood that way, calm as a man, guarding a thing that wasn't there. Behind me, Boyce said, "His name's Cinder." And then, after a while, she named him. Let me put it down plain, the way he gave it to me, because he gave it to me plain, standing at that rail with the dish towel still hanging out of his back pocket like an idiot, and he did not once try to make himself look good. Margie bought that horse in the spring, 4 years back. She bought him at a sale in Bloomfield for $1,900 of egg money and quilt money and 40 years of squirreling. And she bought him because a man there had him in a pen out back with a free-to-good-home sign that had gotten no takers in 2 days, on account of he was 14 years old and colored and had a bad eye. And she could not bring him here. She could not bring him here because we were broke, and because I had said, I have said it 1,000 times, I said it at this very kitchen table, I said it to Junie Altaha in October with my hat in my hand. I had said that a colored horse is a horse that somebody didn't want. So my wife drove that horse 4 miles east and knocked on the door of the man I hated most in this world. Boyce said, she stood right where you're standing, and she said, "Harlan, you owe me one." He laughed. It didn't go anywhere. I said, "I owe you about 6. He kept him. 4 years. He fed that horse and wormed him and had Ruddy Vasquez trim him twice a year and never once put a saddle on him because it wasn't his horse. And Margie came over," Boyce said, "maybe every 3 weeks. Wednesdays, mostly. She'd tell me she was going to Alamogordo for thread, and she'd go 4 miles east and stand at a rail for 2 hours. She was going to tell you," Boyce said. "She was working up to it. She said she was going to wait till we got a wet year and the note was down, and then she was going to bring him home and let you be mad about it for a week." He looked out at the pen. "Then she got sick, and there wasn't a wet year, and we never talked about it again. Not one time. She'd come over and she'd stand there and I'd stand about where I am now, and neither one of us ever said what were we going to do about this." He said, "That's not a good enough reason, Cal. I know it isn't. I've known it for 20 months. And the old horse ate his hay. Here is what I did. I hit Harlan Boyce's fence rail with the flat of my hand hard enough to open the skin across 2 knuckles, and I turned around, and I got right up in that man's face, 61 years old and 68 years old, 2 old men in a dirt yard, and I said things. I said he stole my water. I said it with my finger in his chest. 11 years I have wanted to say it to his face, and I said all of it, every word I'd rehearsed at that gate, and it came out of me like a stopped pipe finally letting go. The $8,000, the 9 days, the pie, my wife's pie, sitting at my table with his hat on the empty chair telling me he had no interest in the Ferguson water. 11 years of driving past. Sonny Delgado's funeral, standing shoulder to shoulder in the receiving line saying nothing. And I raised my hand. I did. I got it up about shoulder height with the blood running down 2 fingers, and Harlan Boyce didn't move and didn't flinch and didn't put his hands up. He just looked at me, and I stood there with my arm cocked like a fool. And then I said the thing that was actually true, which was, "You had 4 years of her. That's it, that's the whole of it, not the water, not $8,000. 4 years of Wednesdays." And Boyce, God damn him, said the only thing a man could say, which was nothing at all. He stood there and let it land on him. He took it the way that old horse took the sun. Then he said, "I did take your water." I put my hand down. "I'd do it again," he said. "I was going under. Cheryl was sick and I was going under, and Ferguson's boy'd have sold it to the pumping outfit and dried us both out, and I made a decision that was good for me and bad for you, and I've never once told myself a story about it." He picked up the dish towel out of his pocket and looked at it like he didn't know where it came from. You want me to say I'm a good man. I'm not going to. I'm a small man, Cal. I've got a small idea of what I need. And there it was. Standing in his yard with my hand bleeding, I heard it in her voice. 12 years ago at the sink, drying a dish. Cal, he's a small man with a small idea of what he needs. I'd carried that around for 11 years like a knife she'd handed me. And she hadn't been handing me a knife at all. She'd been telling me exactly what she'd already decided to do about it. She'd looked at a small man with a small idea of what he needs, and she'd gone right ahead and trusted him with the one thing on this earth she couldn't trust me with. There's a thing I've never been able to make anybody understand about that afternoon. I wasn't angry at Boyce, not after the first 10 minutes. Boyce was just the man standing there. I was standing in a dirt yard 4 miles east of my own house, and I was looking at 18 years of a horse I'd never seen. And what I understood, the way you understand you've broken a bone, before the pain, in that half-second of pure information, was that my wife had spent the last 4 years of her life building me a gift she was afraid to give me. Afraid. Margie Renner, who once put her arm down a badger hole, who told a bank officer in Alamogordo what she thought of him in a voice you could hear in the parking lot. Afraid of me, of my mouth, of the way I'd have laughed. And she'd been right to be. That's the part that keeps me up, not the secret. She was right. 4 years back, if she'd brought a spotted 18-year-old gelding-shaped mistake up my drive, I would have said something I could not have taken back in the yard, in front of God and the dog, and she knew it, because she had been married to me for 33 years and she was not a stupid woman. She wasn't hiding a horse from me. She was waiting for me to become a man she could show him to. And she died waiting. Cordova was still in my yard when I got back. He'd fed my dog something out of his coat pocket, and the dog had forgiven him everything. I sat down on the tailgate of my truck, and I told him to say what he came to say. It was a bloodline program. He'd been at it 19 years, him and a woman up at Nespelem and a couple of families on the Mescalero, and Junie Altaha's grandfather, who I did not know had anything to do with anything. Old blanket stock. The horses the army shot in the 1870s so that people who could ride couldn't. They'd killed most of 1,100 head in a single afternoon up in Idaho, and did the same thing smaller in about 9 other places, and nobody wrote those down. Every so often one comes back up out of the ground. He'd found Cinder 6 years ago in a kill pen outside Bloomfield and hadn't been able to raise the money in time, and the horse went through, and he'd spent 2 years tracing him and found him at Boyce's, and Boyce told him. Cordova said this with a kind of grim admiration. Boyce told him to get off his place. That horse wasn't his to sell. He never knew whose it was. Boyce never said. Junie sent me a photograph in October, Cordova said, of your colt. I said she had no right. No, sir, he agreed, she didn't. He looked out at the dry lot, where a 4-month-old was standing with his hip cocked and his mother, who wasn't beside him. He said, he's the first live foal off that horse in 18 years. There is a version of this where I tell you the number. Cordova wrote one down. It was a good number and it wasn't a fortune, and it was for a breeding share and a boarding arrangement, and a set of obligations 12 pages long, and it would have paid down about 1/3 of that note. 1/3. I've had months to think about why that's the detail I keep coming back to, and I believe it's because 1/3 is exactly the wrong amount. If it had been all of it, I'd have taken it and been a rich fool. If it had been nothing, I'd have thrown him off the place and been a poor one. 1/3 is a number you have to decide about. I sat on that tailgate until the sun went behind the Sacramentos, and the cold came up out of the ground the way it does out here, all at once, like a hand. Cordova got in his truck and left me his card and drove out, and I heard that diesel for a long way down the county road. And I sat there until the yard light came on by itself. I called my son at 11 o'clock at night. He answered on the 4th ring, which means he looked at the screen and thought about it for 3. He said, "Dad is everything." And I said, "I need to tell you what I did to your mother." There was a long silence on that line, the hum in it. And I told him, all of it, the coat on the nail, the horse 4 miles east, the Wednesdays. I told him what I'd said at the kitchen table 12 years ago about colored horses, and how she'd heard it, and how she'd made a plan around it the way you'd build a fence around a bad spot in a pasture. I told him that she had known exactly who I was, and that she had loved me anyway, and that these two facts had lived side by side in her for 4 years and never once touched. And then, because it was 11 at night and I had no more sense left, I said the other thing. In August, I told you your mother wanted you in that room. Weeze didn't say anything. That's true, I said. She did. And it wasn't yours to fix by then, and I knew that when I said it, and I said it anyway, because it was the fastest way I had to hurt you, and I wanted to hurt you, because you were right about the land and I couldn't stand it. The clock on the stove said 11:14. Out in the dry lot, under the yard light, something moved. My son said, and his voice had gone to pieces somewhere in the middle, and he was 39 years old, and I could hear his girl's voice behind him asking who it was. My son said, "I was scared, Dad." He said, "I couldn't. I got as far as the parking lot. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours. 20 months. 20 months, and neither one of us had said a single true word to the other one, because he was ashamed of the parking lot, and I was ashamed of the phone call, and each of us had built a fence around the bad spot, and we had stood on our own sides of it looking straight ahead like it wasn't there. Just like I did at Boyce's gate. For 11 years. Christ, you'd think it would take a man less than 61 years. He came out at Thanksgiving. I'm not going to make more of that than it was. He drove 9 hours and he stood in the yard and neither of us knew what to do with our hands, and we shook hands, which was ridiculous. And then we did the other thing badly, and then we went and looked at a horse, because that is what men in my family do instead of talking. The colt let him walk right up. Then we started around toward his hip, and that spotted 4-month-old turned calm as a man, no hurry in him, and put his shoulder between my son and the mare and stood there. We laughed out loud, first time I'd heard it in years. He said, "What's he doing?" I said I didn't know. That's true, I still don't. Junie says it's the old blood, and Cordova says it's the old blood, and Doc Ainsley says a horse is a horse, and I have watched that colt do it 300 times now, and I have no opinion I'd defend. But I'll tell you what I think about, standing at that fence. I think about a woman standing at a different fence, 4 miles east on a Wednesday with her back to the camera and a rope over her shoulder, putting herself between a thing she loved and the man who might have laughed at it. We drove Ruby home to Boyce's the second week of November. We hauled her. I rode over in the passenger seat of my own truck for the first time since 1996. Boyce came out. He and Weeze shook hands. Boyce said, "You've got your mother's chin," which is not true and which Weeze has repeated to me maybe 11 times since, delighted like a man turning over a coin he found. Nobody apologized. Nobody forgave anybody. We stood at that back rail, 3 men in the cold, and looked at an old horse eating hay. Boyce said the vet thought maybe 2 more years, maybe 3. Cinder lifted his head and looked at us with that pale eye and went back to his flake, and the frost came off him in the sun where his back was wet. I said, "I'll take him in the spring." Boyce said, "All right." That's the whole conversation. That's 11 years and $8,000 and a dead woman's 4 years of Wednesdays, and it took 9 words, and then we all stood there for another 10 minutes not saying anything, which was the actual conversation. On the way out, Boyce put his hand on my truck door. Through the window, not looking at me, he said, "She never said one bad word about you. 4 years, I want you to have that." I have driven past that gate 100 times since, and I have never been able to decide if he was giving me a gift or taking one back. The name. There's a green cloth-bound checkbook in the drawer under the telephone, and on the back page in Margie's hand, in 3 different pens over about 15 years, there is a list of names. 22 of them. She kept the names of horses back there like she was expecting a whole lifetime of them, and she gave out maybe 6, and the rest are just sitting there in her handwriting getting fainter. Cinder is on that list, 4th from the top, written in ballpoint 4 years ago over the top of an older name she'd scratched out. 19 down, near the bottom in pencil from I don't know when, there's one that isn't crossed off and was never used. I'm not going to tell you what it is. That's not me being cute. I've told you the worst things I've ever done. I've told you about the rifle in the barn, and the sentence I said to my son, and the 4 times I set that colt down in the gravel and did arithmetic over him, and I have not held one thing back until now. But that name is hers. She wrote it for a horse she never met, on the back page of a checkbook, in a kitchen in a bad year, and I say it out loud maybe twice a week at a fence line in the dark, and it is the only thing left in this world that belongs to just the 2 of us. I didn't sell the land. I want to be careful here because I know how this is supposed to go, and it doesn't go that way. I didn't sell it yet. The note is still $61,000. Cordova's contract is signed and the first payment cleared in January, and it did what a third of a thing does, which is not enough. There are 38 head on this place. The south windmill pumps 3.5 gallons a minute, and last week I found a dead deer in the tank at the second draw, and I don't want to talk about what that means. We's calls on Sundays. He is coming out in June with the girl, whose name is Anna and who has never seen a horse up close in her life, and he says he wants to talk about the land, and there is a thing in his voice when he says it that I don't like and can't argue with, because he is not wrong. He is 39 and I am 62, and there is a version of this where the smart thing and the right thing are 2 different things, and I have to pick. I'll tell you what I've got. I've got a yearling coming who stands about 14'2" and is covered from the withers back in a white blanket flecked with dark spots, and who turns to face you when you go behind him, and who has never once in his life made the little rusty hinge sound that foals make. Not one time. He is silent as a stone, and he watches everything. And I've got a green ledger on the kitchen table. I've kept one every year since I was 19. Rain in the left column, head count, feed, vet, and in the margins because she started it, and because after she died I found I couldn't stop other things.